Alright, today's chapter is going to be on chapter 10. This is both emotional and social development in those years, say between 7 and 11 approximately. Now, in Erikson's view, this one is all about industry versus inferiority. And as noticed in some of the previous chapters, the author talks a whole lot about industry, but doesn't want to talk about the inferiority part because that would make people feel bad. So let's talk about the inferiority aspect. I mean, it's a huge part of his theory. Now, the idea behind Erikson's industry versus inferiority is that you have the time of the life when they can start to really be social creatures. So they're, like I said, they're starting to look outside of themselves cognitively, starting to realize they're part of a bigger part of the world, and so this lets them want to really help out in a big way. And for those of you that have seen children when they're before this age, in their toddler and infant years, they do want to help out. If you're doing the dishes, they'll want to do the dishes too, which is annoying because they usually can't help in any way. They just make it. They're usually more of a hindrance than a help. But they want to help, but they just want to kind of go through the motions of helping. It's like they're imitating you without actually having any semblance of goal. They're not trying to get anything done. They're just trying to copy mom, copy dad, copy brother and sister, whatever. And so at this point in their development, they're starting to socially and emotionally think of themselves as their own person, and possibly because they can see other people at this point, they start to want to see themselves as somebody as well. So they want to accomplish goals, and so this is where industry comes in. And we probably wouldn't even use this language anymore. We would probably talk about wanting to accomplish something, to have goals, maybe goal oriented versus inferiority these days. And so that's really what they want to do. More importantly, they're capable of doing it. And this becomes a critical period. Remember, Erikson's theory is all about the critical periods that we see over and over and over again. And so if you have a child of this age, or you see a child of this age, you need to put these kids to work. On a social development point of view, child labor laws are horrible because this is where the kid can really start to develop their work ethic. And in this particular culture, we like to put work ethic off a really, really long time. Some people have the opinion that kids, shouldn't have jobs, that even when they get to be in the teenage years, they're like, well, he needs to concentrate on his schooling or that sort of thing. And really, developmentally, it's just not the case. This is the time, if you wait, it's going to be that much harder for them to learn a proper work ethic. And more importantly, by the time they're done this particular stage, they'll have either gotten a work ethic, they'll be able to accomplish something and take pride in their accomplishments, or they will see that other people are, and we'll get into the social aspects of this in a little bit. They'll see that other people are spending tons of time accomplishing something, and so they will feel inferior. They will see that other people are simply more worthwhile than they are. Now, interestingly enough, we don't see the inferiority a lot, and this is because they talk about self-esteem a lot in the book. And like I said, the book takes kind of a clinical aspect of psychology in some regards, which it honestly just isn't scientifically sound. And as a scientist, I've got the lab coat and everything to prove it. I really like more proof-based research. I don't want to just take somebody's feelings on how it makes them feel and call it good science. So as far as they go into self-esteem in here, and self-esteem is actually a result of the industry versus inferiority. There's a lot of trying to boost people's self-esteem, talking about how to boost self-esteem in children, what the effects of positive self-esteem are, all that sort of thing, even within this chapter, which I hope you learn and go over. But the entire point of industry versus inferiority is about self-esteem. It's about naturally developing the self-esteem instead of having using self-esteem as a defense mechanism, as Freud would word it. Which is basically lying to yourself about self-esteem. You can tell kids all day long that they're worthwhile, and they will parrot it. They will repeat it back, and there will be a part of them that believes it. But unless they get this work ethic and they feel they really earn it, they will always feel inferior. And so they will constantly, for the rest of their lives, try to artificially inflate their sense of self-esteem. They'll tell themselves, and you see kids this age do this all the time because they're still struggling with it. As an example, I was teaching my child archery when he was, I think, 6, and he and his peers were starting to get into this stage. And we went over to invite one of his friends. Like, we have the archery all set up out back. Would you like to try? And he's like, yeah, I've done archery before. I'm excellent at it. I'm awesome. I'm like the best archer ever. And of course he wasn't. He literally couldn't even hit the entire target from 5 feet away. But the fact is, they're trying to inflate this sense of self-esteem because at this age they have nothing to be proud of. They have no accomplishments. And adults have a hard time even teaching them how to get accomplishments because there's so much they can't do. So this industry versus inferiority is really a really important aspect of their life. And so it's important to try to give the kids a sense of accomplishment in any way possible. And as I probably mentioned, there are some things that are difficult to teach people because we use these vague terms like we'll teach them work ethic. But meanwhile, as a parent or a caregiver, you have to actually give them things to do. And teachers try to do this all the time. They'll try to give kids something to do, but in the meantime they come back with a bunch of papers that their parents just throw away because it's just random awful art projects. I can give you an example. My daughter was 7. We noticed that she was starting to get into this particular stage. So I gave her some cloth and I taught her how to make a doll. And it looks like a voodoo doll. It is hideously ugly. But the important part is that she made something and it was permanent. And since it was the first time she had done something, it was actually kind of interesting to watch from almost a clinical perspective because she had this cloth and she drew out 2 pieces of cloth, one on top of another. She drew this humanish shape, and then pinned it all together, cut it out, and then started hand sewing around the edges to keep it, and then obviously just turn it inside out, stuff it, and you have a doll. Put some button eyes on it. And so she was doing this. Mostly because we told her to, because I wanted her to have something with a little bit of some semblance of accomplishment she could feel. And after she was done, it was very obvious that she had never felt accomplishment before in her life. She's looking at it like, she didn't even have words to describe the fact that this wasn't something she was ever going to want to throw away. This was something she was actually proud of. And pride, this is the first time they can actually get pride. Which is interesting for even cognitive development, although I know that was yesterday, because they can't really even get pride in their schoolwork until they can actually accomplish something. It's something other people haven't done, something above the norm. Now, at the same time, a lot of us rebel against this attitude because we're like, children need time to be children. They need time to play. And a lot of us have these farcical notions of I was robbed of my childhood, which is almost always wrong, by the way. If you're thinking that you were robbed of your childhood, you weren't. The amount of people robbed of their childhood is almost nil in this country, unless you were, working at a sweatshop in some foreign country and had to work 10 hours a day for pennies. You had a childhood. Maybe not the one that you dream of, but I don't think any of us get that. And your children won't either. That's just how it works. But trust me, children will play. They will have a childhood, even if they have to work 4 hours a day. Whether it's helping out around the house or building things or, apprenticing for somebody else, which is a cultural habit we've unfortunately forgotten, at least in our culture. Children will play when they do things, and it will constantly be a part of learning for them. Um, so now that they're getting accomplishments, they're starting to get the ability for pride. Um, for the first time in their life, they can actually be proud of something. They're going to start to get self-concept. Now, if you ask somebody, say in the pre-operational stage, or in any sort of stage of Erickson's before industry versus inferiority, and you ask the kid to define themselves, describe yourself, uh, they're going to describe themselves, but it's going to be in ways that are not permanent. They'll say, or very vague. Like if I asked my daughter when she was 5, I'd say, well, what, describe yourself, and she would say, well, I'm a good girl. And that's vague. That doesn't actually mean anything. That's the sort of thing we tell 5-year-olds just because they're 5, and that's about as best as they can understand. And she wouldn't be able to give many examples of her being good, or if so, they're very fleeting. By the time they're this age, their sense of self-concept is based on things that they do all the time, things that are very stable. The example in the book was, a girl said that she was a very good cellist. She played the cello. And so this is something that she's actually accomplished at. And this is actually another one of the reasons why industry versus inferiority is so important, because if they haven't actually accomplished anything by the time they're, say, 11, their sense of self-concept is not going to be developed because they have nothing to base it on. They're just not going to believe you that they're a good person. That's not good enough for them anymore because they're thinking more. Now, the last thing that I want to go over here, and I'll go over all the rest of the stuff tomorrow, is that as far as emotional development goes, they reach a different point in their lives because at this point they can understand other things. They can have different emotional displays. It's actually debatable. I mean, last time we went over emotion 1, emotion 2, and emotion 3. And as I mentioned, in a way, all the tests and lectures are going to be cumulative because if you don't learn something, you're going to have no idea what I'm talking about the next day. And this is a great example of it because I'm not going to bother to define it for people. You either learned it or you're up the river. We don't actually know if toddlers or babies have emotion 3. We don't know, just like you wouldn't know if your dog or cat had emotion 3. Emotion 1 we can definitely measure. So let's say you take a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old, they're trying to learn something, they're very frustrated, they're going to cry, they're going to act out. And so emotion 2 is going to be very, very salient. It's going to be obvious. You're going to know that's there without a shadow of a doubt. But it's actually debatable whether or not they even possess emotion 3 in any way. It's actually arguable that emotion 2 is so strong because of their complete and utter reliance on adults that's all they need. On an evolutionary basis, emotion 3 is useless for them at this point because the only emotions that they're typically displaying are things that are there just for the display. So at this point, now that you get to industry versus inferiority, this is a stage where they do seem to actually have emotion 3. And once they're at this stage, you're going to start to remember things more. You can probably remember what it was like to be 10 or 11. You're not going to remember what it was like to be 4. You're going to remember brief little bits, maybe things you did, but not really how you felt, not what you were thinking. So it's actually arguable whether or not you felt much at all. And if you did, they were probably or they could be anyway, relatively fleeting and not like a day-to-day occurrence. I mean, as an adult, even as a 10-year-old, emotions are constant. You don't pass by a couple of minutes without having an emotion. As a matter of fact, when you don't feel an emotion, you say, I'm bored. You might call it apathy. You'll put a different emotion in there to substitute for no emotion at all, because emotions are such a large part of our life. So this is a stage of life where children are definitely capable of having emotion 3. And So you're really gonna. This is where the emotional education is even more important than it was before, and it's a very critical period. If you miss the emotional education at this point, if they are 11 years old and they still don't understand how to react properly to emotions, when to use emotional suppression and when to use cognitive reappraisal, and I understand that people don't necessarily use these terms, but uh, but the fact is we use the strategies, even if we're not using the names themselves. And there are times when you need to use suppression, and there are times when you need to use cognitive reappraisal. And at this point, by the time they're done, by the time they're, say, 12, cognitive reappraisal should be the main strategy they use, or else, honestly, they've been taught improperly. And they're going to have a very difficult time through the next stages, which is going to be adolescence, which is really rough emotionally. So for the next chapter, we're going to go in to the rest of chapter 10, and as you probably noticed, this one is a little shorter, especially for talking about emotional and social things, and that's because they're really taking the chapter in a clinical way, which we'll get into a little bit more next time, and honestly, as a scientific level, there's really not that much interesting in this stage. Uh, unless you're really dwelling on the incredibly rare occurrences of something bad happen, a lot more rare than we're told. Um, this is a very there's a reason why Freud referred to it as a stage of latency, where basically nothing was going on. It's a relatively stable, healthy stage. It's pre-puberty. There's all these both advantages and drawbacks that they have, but the drawbacks are relatively small. So we'll go into the next half next time.